My name is Andrea Gokus, and I'm a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis. At the A4E Symposium, I am going to present our work on the assessment of greenhouse gas emissions due to astronomy conferences, so basically our global travel that we as astronomers did in 2019. I did not do the work alone. I have the pleasure of working with a lot of people from Astronomers for Planet Earth. This is all of us, and we are also preparing a paper right now where we will present all what I'm about to show you today, and even a little bit more. Now, the carbon footprint of research is very versatile. There's a variety of contributing factors. There have been quite a lot of papers on this topic in the past 2 years. And among them, a significant fraction is actually travel to conferences or also other meetings. And depending on which study one looks at, it varies between 17 and 47%. Now, in these two plots here, you can see the distribution of contributing factors to the carbon footprint of astronomy in an institute, the IRAP on the down left, and the right one shows the individual emission contributions per Australian astronomer. And this has been all covered in depth in topic 1 of the symposium. But this was our motivation to look a bit further into the travel that we do, and the most travel that we usually do is actually going to conferences. Now, the astronomy conferences in 2019, we obtained our data from different databases. A large number of conferences that we looked at were listed at the Canadian Astronomy Data Center webpage. Then there was also exoplanet.eu, and there are also some more local meetings that took place in the Indian and Australian community where we obtained data from. We were only interested in the information where participants come from in terms of city, institute, or country, basically to analyze and estimate the travel that they did. So a lot of the information was actually publicly available, and for those where we couldn't find a participant list or we couldn't find a web page anymore, we requested anonymized data from the conference organizers. To estimate the footprint of the travel, we used the travel carbon footprint calculator that was developed by Didier Beret. It's on a web page, and it's fairly easy to use. All you need to give it is the conference venue and then basically the origin of the participants. And it only distinguished between a plane and a train. So we did not calculate something an extra for driving somewhere by car. Overall, we looked at 258 conferences, and that summed up to a total of greenhouse of 37,700 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And summing up the whole travel distance that astronomers did, or the data that we have, it comes up to 1.5 astronomical units. So we travel quite a lot. In general, the overall mean of the emission that was produced per conference, per person at a conference, it's about a little bit more than 1 ton of CO2 equivalent emissions. However, there is actually quite a large disparity, as you will see in a second. In terms of where meetings happen worldwide, this is a map that shows both the location as well as the overall carbon footprint from a conference, which obviously scales also with the number of participants. And also encoded in color is the contribution, the average carbon footprint per person at that conference. So what you can see here right now is that a lot of meetings cluster in Europe as well as in the US, on the west and east coast. And there are some conferences that are very, very dark, have a very dark color here, especially in Australia. We will have a look at that in a sec as well. And there were only 3 conferences that we knew of that took place in Africa. This is just to show a little bit more scientifically the distribution where conference venues happen to be in 2019. Nearly the majority happened in Europe as far as our data is concerned. Nearly half of all the conferences took place there, and then about a quarter took place in North and Central America. A little bit less in Asia, and then the rest is distributed between Oceania, South America, and Africa. Now we can do the same for the participants, where participants came from, and that would look like this. It is a bit similar to the conference venue distribution. However, there is a bit of a larger portion actually of North and Central American participants. However, I want to stretch that we did not count each person as a singular, so that actually just represents who attends more conferences in this. It shows that Europeans and also North and Central Americans attend the majority of conferences. This is a histogram showing the emission per participant per conference on the y-axis, and it's a histogram, so you can see the distribution peaking at about 1 ton. So this is the mean average I already spoke of. In color, you can also see the different conference venues again, and you can see that it's quite widespread. There are several meetings where it falls below the average, but there is a longer tail that goes to higher, a larger carbon footprint actually in the meetings, and the majority seem to be in Oceania in particular. However, there are some more with a much less carbon footprint from Oceania also in this lower range here. So there it seems to be quite widespread, which has probably something to do with the internationality of these meetings, as Australia is a bit harder to reach from Europe and North America, and we already know that most of the participants actually come from there. Also, the African conferences that we looked at, which were probably just very local, very international meetings compared to local meetings between African institutes, they can also be found at the higher end of, or the higher side of the carbon footprint. In terms of the size of a meeting, we also wanted to know, well, does this correlate? And we find actually that it does not. No, so the what we had on the x-axis before is now on the y-axis. Again, that's the greenhouse gas emissions per person, the mean greenhouse gas emissions per person. And on the x-axis, we have the number of attendees of a conference or participants. And since we have some very large meetings included in our data sample, which are mainly the EAS and the AAS meetings of that year, we need to use a log scale. And we find that actually the large meetings do not have the highest carbon footprint per person, but actually that it clusters around where with the amount of about 100 attendees. And so, this again, we have some meetings that happen in Oceania or Australia, where this is disproportionately large. But we also find some meetings, and this also seems to be a bit independent from the size of a meeting, with a very, very low carbon footprint. So we also looked at the localness of meetings. And localness or local means here that the participants of a conference have to travel less than 100 kilometers to the conference venue. So we define this as local because this is something while you would still go there by car probably, or maybe by train, depending on where it takes place. It's still a very short distance. Now we have, again, in this plot, the same y-axis, and the x-axis shows the fraction of local participants. And it's not surprising that the meetings with a very high local participation have a very low carbon footprint, and then it scales up, and with the lowest or zero local participants, we also find these meetings that have a high carbon footprint. However, there are some meetings here where the range of the fraction of local participants is very wide, and it still does not produce a high carbon footprint per person. So it seems like it is possible still to have meetings, even with not just your own colleagues, where you can actually be a bit more sustainable in that way. Now, from our study, we have some implications that I want to talk about, and that I hope that we can discuss at the discussion session. And the first one is to avoid flying. This plot is taken from Butcher et al., where they looked at the conference, the EAS conference that took place in Lyon. They made a survey afterwards, and this is the data they analyzed. And from looking at that, there's still you can see there is the possibility, still a lot of potential to switch from a plane to the train and still travel within a reasonable amount of time from different countries. So switching from an aircraft to something else like a train, definitely a good idea. However, other studies, this one study by Janke et al. Has shown that for the MPIA, only less than 10% of all flights that were taken, they could only substitute via train. So if you meet with someone, obviously, on a different continent, you still need to fly. However, it is possible to optimize the meeting location. If you know who is taking place in who wants to take part in a conference, or if you know about your target group, you can use, for example, the travel carbon footprint calculator that we use to assess the emissions from the conferences. You can also use this as a tool to define or to determine which city, which institute, whatever, would be the best choice in terms of achieving the lowest carbon footprint. Also, a possibility, of course, is just to reduce the number of in-person meetings for the same target group, especially because, well, is it necessary that the same people meet like 5 times in person a year, or is just once or maybe twice enough? And can these other meetings, can they be substituted by online collaboration? And another good idea, obviously, I mean, I guess most of us usually try to do this also in terms of reducing the costs, but still, if there are conferences that kind of have the same target group, maybe if they're organized in the same region, then one could try combine several trips to conferences, or combine a conference visit with a visit of an institute that's nearby, and collaborate a bit further there. Last but not least, of course, it is very important to consider different formats due to the inaccessibility of in-person meetings, and this affects several groups. One would be people that travel, that always need a visa to travel to Europe, to North America, where it's a long and tedious process to get these visas for just a conference trip for just a week. And I've heard so many stories of how horrible these things can go, and people cannot attend meetings in Europe or North America. And we really need to think about these things, because apparently, so North Americans and Europeans are the majority taking part in these meetings, and maybe the question there should be, why is that? Another group is people that have caring responsibilities, and this proportionally affects women, and also people with problems in terms of mobility might have a hard time to travel long distance to go on a flight, and this could all be solved if we would do more online meetings, or develop also other concepts of these kind of meetings, which is something that Vanessa Moss in this session is talking about. And I think the pandemic has shown us that this can actually work. Personally, I've met all my colleagues from Astronomers for Planet Earth only online, and so far it's working out great to work together, even though we haven't met in person yet. Now, these are again these things I want to discuss, and I'm looking forward to discuss in the discussion session that takes place on Thursday, December 1st, either at 8 a.m. UTC or at 5 p.m. UTC, and I'm looking forward to meeting you.